Hey, good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope many of you have managed to get your vaccinations and that everyone is staying safe and wearing masks and reading many biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event is on April 15th with Blake Bailey, a great biographer who will be discussing his new, well-reviewed biography of Philip Roth with Mary Carr. But tonight we are here to celebrate Timothy Brennan for his absorbing biography, Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Syed. Professor Timothy Brennan is the author of At Home in the World, Cosmopolitanism Now, Borrowed Light, Vico, Hegel, and the Colonies, and Salman Rushdie and the Third World, Myths of the Nation. His writing has appeared in The Nation, the London Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and many other publications. He teaches in the Humanities Department at the University of Minnesota and has received fellowships from the Fulbright Program and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please look up his book and others online at bookshops.org, a site that leads you to your local independent bookstore. Now, I will be in conversation with Timothy for about 40 minutes and then take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the chat box below to type in your questions, and I will be sure to get to as many as I can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Timothy Brennan, congratulations on this formidable accomplishment. I want to say that as a young man, when I was an assistant editor at The Nation in New York City, I got to know Edward Syed a bit. I remember dropping by his apartment one afternoon to help him make some last-minute edits on an article he was writing for the magazine on the PLO. And I have to say, I was always intimidated by him. But in your pages, he comes across as both intimidating, but also endearing and terribly vulnerable and self-conscious. It's a very human portrait. Syed was an astonishing intellectual, a scholar of Joseph Conrad, but also a concert-level pianist, and of course, the author of the seminal work Orientalism. But he was also a political activist on behalf of Palestine, and also a co-founder with Daniel Barenboim of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. He wrote op-eds in the New York Times, but also co-authored a column on music in The Nation. Places of Mind is a great title, I think, for an intellectual biography, but this book is much more than that. You examine his writings, but you also show his personal life. Anyway, where shall we begin? Why don't you talk a bit about your own early friendship with Syed as one of his students?
Well, I wasn't really the normal type, I think, that went to grad school at Columbia. I had taken time off between college. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I think it's fair to say that I became to a certain extent radicalized there. There was a wonderful social history professor who had classes of 250 people in it named Harvey Goldberg, who really trained a generation. People have written books, in fact, about his influence on them. So I came to New York following that, and I was working in Latin neighborhoods, doing political organizing for 2 years. So when I did get into Columbia, I sort of, heard that he was a person to get to know, and I marched into his office thinking that, the waters would part, and, I was here to take a seminar, and I didn't know that, you actually had to be let in, and that there were only so many seats. I think he didn't take me seriously. I think I was a curiosity to him. He was very interested in plying me for life on the streets, as it were. So it took a while for me to win his respect. Let me put it that way. So maybe 2 or 3 years in, I began to write essays that caught his notice, and then we became advisor and advisee. This did not mean being friendly. I mean, he can be very boyish and very informal, but as you say, he can also be very intimidating. So you would never go into his office to just about chat about ideas. You know, you'd go in there with a piece of writing, and you would expect it to be a finished piece of writing, and hope that you weren't interrupted 20 times by a call from the UN or from Jacques Berck in France or something like that. So that was the kind of thing it was. But eventually, when I got to the point of writing my dissertation, which I did write on Salman Rushdie, we were much, much closer. And after I left, we kept up our relationship. I taught in New York for a long time after. I would teach his classes at times when he was out of town, go over to his house for scotch and things like that. And so the day he died, actually, we had been planning on my writing a response to the scurrilous attack on him by his former friend Christopher Hitchens in the Atlantic Monthly, who wrote on the 25th anniversary of the publication of Orientalism, and he wanted me to respond. So I did respond, but I sent him the piece as I had finally finished it only on the day he died. He never got to read it.
Wow, he never got to read it.
No.
Well, I want to come back to Hitchens and Syed in a moment, but so how many years after his death did you decide to tackle this biography?
It came kind of out of the blue. I'd written a lot about Edward, maybe 13 essays or so, in various kinds of venues. Some of them foreign venues, like in the big interest, for example, in Turkey and or in Germany, and I'd be asked from time to time to write about him. So I wrote these essays about him. I felt I knew his work very, very well. I'd obviously been influenced by him to the point where my own work I saw as carrying on some of his ideas. There were also some significant departures, but I never thought about writing a biography. It wasn't clear in my head that I could write a biography. So what happened
But
was,
you'd written about Rushdie, right?
right, there are things that I had written that were biographical like, that they're large swaths of straight biographies. So definitely my writing on Rushdie, the very first book of mine was very much like a biography. And there were long biographical passages on C.L.R. James, the great Trinidadian scholar and activist, and Alejo Carpentier, the kind of the creator of magic realism in Latin America, in this book At Home in the World. So it's sort of I thought a way of doing it, but a whole book, especially about somebody as complicated and diverse as Syed, not to mention that I knew him personally, which was another kind of impediment. But I got a call out of the blue from a New York literary agent, Andrew Wiley, which
Oh,
doesn't happen every day. And
right.
he, you know,
A
and he
very
said,
powerful book agent.
very powerful. In fact, I knew his name because he was Rushdie's agent for the Satanic Verses at the time of the scandal. But he said there is a lot of interest in New York right now among commercial publishers for an intellectual biography of Edward Said, and I've heard that you're the person to write it. So I was in the middle of writing other things. I had to think hard about that, about dropping all of that. But there was just too much on the line. I mean, I wanted this story told right, and I had a commitment to doing so. And I thought it would also teach me things about reaching a different kind of audience. And so I thought, I have to do this. So I
So
dropped
what year was that call from Wiley?
2015, the latter part of 2015.
So
So
you did this relatively quick. I mean, in 5 years.
is that relatively quick?
Oh, absolutely. Biography can be endless, as we
I'm
all
so
know.
glad you said that. I was feeling like a real laggard that
No, no, no.
I thought honestly, I thought that I was going to finish this in a couple of years, and that the delay in my own work, things that I'd been working on, would only be delayed for 2 years. But it took me at least 3.5 years to get enough of the information gathered through
Yeah.
interviews
So
and
what
going to
were
archive.
the sources, both
Is this
archival?
sunlight getting in the way? Should I pull this down? Is the sunlight in the
Well, I
way?
think you're fine. We can all see you.
Okay.
You're mottled with sun a bit.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Um, so what were the problems? Was it archival? Was it getting access to interviews?
Yeah,
Were
there's a
there?
couple of things. One of them was that he knew a lot of people, and he
Yeah.
had his hand in lots of different things all over the world. So the people that I needed to interview were spread out everywhere. And so just to get them on the phone and to talk to them at all was difficult. Secondly, a lot of people had been burned, people who knew Syed in his childhood, because there were people who wanted to defame Syed or in some way make him look bad, who had sought them out and then twisted their words. And so they were very reluctant to talk to me. Uh, and then there was the whole question that I'm sure any biographer would come upon, which is that when you get people finally to talking, they want to talk about themselves rather than the subject. And then, of course, there's the whole question of what people don't remember or what they misremember or what they pretend to have forgotten. And then there's the whole question of needing to triangulate. So those were some problems. The Columbia papers of Edward Said are very rich, but they're also very disorganized. Nobody's actually gone in and done that yet, although the people who got it to the stage it's in were absolutely heroic. Claire Carroll, I think, is one of the people who worked for Edward for a while as an assistant, and she did a fantastic job pulling everything together. But it's still hard to find your way around there. You dig through 10,000 items of correspondence before you find one that isn't like routine business correspondence. So there's those kinds of things, and then there's just finding the other archives that you need to do. So getting the okay, for example, from the family to look into his student transcripts from the various schools, which was a gold mine for me.
Mhm.
Getting the FBI files on Edward were not difficult to get, but they were heavily redacted. So they were very frustrating.
Right.
Those kinds of problems. Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about his identity. Um, you know, like Edward Said, I actually spent much of my childhood in Jerusalem and Beirut and Cairo. And then I had to transition into America. And I really empathized with Said's journey, as I knew how difficult it must have been for a young man, a teenager, to come to America and to a boarding school. And anyway, Said had multiple identities. So he could apparently dream in Arabic, but speak fluent French and English in both an Oxford accent and an American accent. I mean, he's really a chameleon in many ways, right? Talk about his identity in his early childhood. And
The 2 points I'd like to make about that are these, that we think of identity as being primarily about one's ethnic identity or place of birth. I think that it's important to take note of the fact that Edward was born American. He was an American citizen at birth because by virtue of his father, who in order to escape the Turkish draft, came to the United States as a young man and acquired American citizenship. So in those days, his children could be Americans even if they were born in Cairo or in Jerusalem in his case. But I think Edward was really clear in his own writing, although, I mean, obviously his Palestinian identity was transforming, um, transformative. And it's also the case, of course, that he did and was very conscious of feeling to be a non-white person. And some of the schools that he went to in the 1950s treated him that way, both surreptitiously and openly. So I don't mean to diminish the normal ways in which we understand identity, but I think it's important that he was really keen on saying that we're also identities on the basis, we have identities on the basis of what we think and what we believe and what we've chosen and what traditions we, affiliate ourselves with. And this, in this sense as well, he was a person of many identities. He was somebody who frequently would make the point that one of the advantages of being a humanist and an intellectual is that we are not boxed within any area of specialization. That he would boldly, with a bit of cheek even, venture into anthropology or into economics or into history because he felt that to not do so would make it impossible for him to make broad connections and to see society as a totality. So this too is another way of understanding his multiple identities. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think it's important to take the focus uniquely off of racial and national identities when talking about Edward's multiple selves. He had a very compartmentalized approach to life. And he was the kind of person who's kind of composing an essay in his head at the same time that he's preparing for an interview, on Nightline with Gene Kirkpatrick. And he can talk to you and make you feel like you're right there and he's absorbing every word you're saying. And then 5 minutes later, it sort of clicks off and his eyes go vacant. You realize his mind is somewhere else. So in order to do all the things he did and to do them as well as he did, I think it was really this genius of being able to compartmentalize the various things that he was and the various things that he thought.
So he was a concert level pianist as well. I mean, at Princeton, he was actually thinking about becoming, a musician. So he was a polymath in that way, but and where did that come from, do you think? Can you tell us a little bit about his childhood in Cairo and his
I think by the time
summers
he's
in Beirut and
right, by the time that he is a mature man and a well-known scholar and activist for Palestinian rights, I think it's not accurate any longer to say that he was concert level pianist. He just didn't have enough time to practice. I mean, to be at that level, you need to practice 10 hours a day, and he didn't. And so he couldn't be. In fact, when I did sit down with Daniel Barenboim to interview him in a New York hotel, Barenboim was in New York to do the complete Bruckner symphonies, at Carnegie Hall. I had this long talk with him. He's buying me wine, and we're having this great conversation. It was wonderful. He says that Edward, I said, how well could Edward play? Because they played together often. And he said he's a very, very good pianist, but he didn't practice enough. So, right. But earlier in his life, when he's at Mount Hermon, right, which is the first school he goes, this is in Massachusetts, first school he comes to after his schooling in Cairo, he practiced constantly and he was brilliantly good. And he did study music, in fact, music theory, music composition, in a very, very elite group of teachers at Princeton, a great music department. And he was still practicing then. And I have heard recordings of him at that stage of his life. And to my ear, at any rate, it's astounding what he did. But the reason that he was seriously considering becoming a pianist, and he never dropped the idea until he entered graduate school at Harvard much later, was really, I think, that it was his first love. I mean, his first intellectual stimulation came from music, not from literature or philosophy. Apart from, reading the Book of Common Prayer, as a formative young boy in Cairo, the first things that he was reading were music encyclopedias or the history of opera. The first intellectual encounters he had were with his teacher, Ignace Tigerman, a Polish Jew emigre to Cairo, who would teach him. He didn't just teach anybody. You had to be pretty good. And he went in there, and the lingua franca in this salon was French. And this was a serious intellectual encounter he had very young, the very first. So I think that music was really, really important to him all the way through. First as a formative thing, but later, when his identity as an intellectual was formed in other areas, it was important as an escape. It was a place for him to not have the pressure of being, the leader, not having to be tactful with the people that he was reviewing. He can be very harsh in his reviews of performances he didn't like because, this wasn't his field. And finally, it was a place that he could indulge his aesthetic appetites. He didn't allow him to do that.
Here's a picture of Edward
Yeah.
playing the piano,
Yeah.
I guess late in life, but
Yeah.
so it was an escape for him, something to, well, he's a very complicated guy. You also, I noted in the text, you talk about how he saw a psychiatrist all his life. And you write at one point, although he let few see it, he lived in agony. He was a bundle of contradictions, I guess, and insecurities. Talk about that.
Yeah. He didn't really start therapy until he was an undergrad, I think. But he did remain in therapy for the rest of his life, and rather intensive therapy. So, one of the surprises for me in writing the book was to come to realize what I hadn't realized, that he was deeply invested in psychology and not necessarily psychoanalysis. That's different. Maybe he was undergoing psychoanalysis, but it was not really the way to put it. But he's terribly interested in the fact that the Arab world has no proper theory of mind. And so, in other words, in the analysis of social situations or the accounting for certain historical developments or the understanding of how certain artistic styles came into practice and all of those kinds of things that humanists ask, that there was no psychological dimension to their interpretation that he wanted desperately to, rectify. So this is a very, very important thing for him. But Edward was someone who, let's put it this way, his memoir, his award-winning memoir, Out of Place, which only takes us up through his life at um, at Mount Hermon. We don't really get much of undergraduate life at all, and it sort of stops at a certain point. But that wonderful memoir of his, which was so revealing of certain psychological foibles, which he was very open about and even wore on his sleeve, was originally called Not Quite Right. And that was what he really wanted the title to be right up until the moment that it went to press. And I think they settled for Out of Place because it's more clearly about, land and place, and that would be associated
Right.
with his Palestinian politics. But really, Not Quite Right is the right way of putting it, because that means that you're not comfortable around anybody. Mariam, his widow, has been so helpful to me in the writing of this biography. But one of the things she points out is he cannot be alone. It was impossible for him to be alone. If of course, in a study, but then he's right next to
He
people,
had to be alone to write.
you had to be alone to write. And in that sense, I suppose you shut the door, but you're in an apartment with other people, but you can't be off and alone, never. But by the same token, when he's around other people, he is concealing himself. So this first book he writes on Joseph Conrad, you'd think that, well, of course, he's interested in Conrad for obvious reasons. Conrad is writing about imperialism. Conrad is in exile himself. He's a Pole who comes over to England and becomes English. He is someone who loved Wagner. He's someone who loved the language of French. All of these things would be points of contact with Edward. But what Edward is really writing about in that first book is how Conrad wore masks, and he was really wonderful at hiding himself. And that it was in the process of writing that he created a persona for himself. And that's, I think, what Edward took to heart from Conrad. And it
Oh,
shows this.
he
Yeah.
created his own. He was very good at creating his own persona, and it was a magnificent. I mean, he was, as I said, a bundle of contradictions, but he was a man who was an intellectual, a left winger, a Palestinian nationalist, who also loved really expensive clothes and French cuffs and expensive fountain pens. And he had no problem, walking the streets of New York or Cairo or Beirut, dressed like a very dapper Englishman. Huh?
Well, in a way, he did have a problem with it. He did it and he loved it. It was something he could do because his father was well off.
Mm-hmm.
Is something I think that he loved because of the aesthetic sensibility of it, right? So he wrote with the fountain pen, I think, because of the sumptuousness of the act of writing, with an absorbent blue paper and, the ink that flows out of it. I think that this was something that he appreciated aesthetically. But everybody has made, not everybody, many people have made this point about his apparent contradiction, that here's this person who's supporting the downtrodden and yet he's well dressed. But it was a very weird kind of being well dressed in a sense. I always thought it very stodgy, very old fashioned, honestly. It wasn't like the latest Milan fashion, right? This was Savile Row stuff, right? This is the duds of an English gentleman. that he wore, right? Burberry suits and Rolex watches and this kind of thing. And he looked absolutely fabulous. He's always terrifically well groomed, and of course he's handsome and animated and funny. So the whole package was sort of overwhelming. But he did feel self-conscious about this at the same time, and would frequently, under the influence of chemo drugs later in his life, he broke down and was crying with a friend, saying, "How can I possibly justify going out and buying suits for 500 pounds, when people are starving?" And so he would beat himself up about it. And in his memoir, of course, he really does also say, with a tone of self-mockery, that he was cocooned in his privilege, and therefore separated from the falahin,
Right,
of
right.
Cairo.
Well, he was.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
He felt bad about it. I don't know if that, makes it okay, but it's something to note about his own sense of self, and that inner turmoil that he always felt.
so as you mentioned, he was essentially born an American because of his father. Um, but you argue in the book that he really was proud of this country as an immigrant's republic. And yet he also, particularly, I guess, at Mount Hermon, as a young teenager, he could write his parents these anguished letters about his feelings of inferiority. Um, and that again, I commend you. You, as the biographer, you really do humanize this intimidating intellectual figure. You show he's struggling, and it's astonishing how these feelings of insecurity were with him, I guess, all his life.
They
Uh,
were. They were. I mean, he was out of place in Cairo itself, you might say, by being an American, because there was a certain aura around him uh, for being an American. And the fact that his father had the concession for office goods with the British government, the fact that they were Anglicans,
right.
which is a very small Christian sect in Cairo, and that's of course, the religious preference of the British. All of these sorts of things made him not be of the place in Cairo as well. The fact that he was what they call a Shami, which is how the people in Egypt at the time referred to refugees from Greater Syria, which is how they would have seen the Palestinians.
Right.
Yeah. So for all of those reasons, but
So let's talk a little bit about his major book, Orientalism. It became an astonishing bestseller, translated into dozens of languages. Um, but you're very good at sort of walking through the minefield of the intellectual battles over that book in particular. But I took note that you also wrote that he thought that theory, ironically enough, was dangerous to his students. That if you got wrapped up too much in critical literary theory or other theories, that this was uh, a distraction from reality, I guess. Is that correct?
yes, but I think it has to be qualified. He would have been known to many people in the profession as someone who introduced theory, as it came to be known in shorthand, theory, like, as though it's just one thing or one group of writers, but that is how it came to be referred to. Um, he came of age and was a grad student at a time that English studies was rather, stick in the mud. It was a bunch of people who read poems by Donne over and over again, and they didn't care if their students knew anything about history or about politics or about the biography of the author, nothing like that. It was really kind of intellectually dead from his point of view. And he, under the influence of his mentor, one of his two mentors, PhD advisors at Harvard, named Harry Levin, wanted very much to turn the eyes of the profession more towards Europe. So it's kind of paradoxical that he's associated after Orientalism with being,
Yes.
a kind of like a denouncer of all things Eurocentric, whereas what he really was trying to do is inject sort of the philosophical liveliness, right? And the intellectual depth and complexity of continental thinkers into the American Academy. And he did this, given the age in which he was coming of age, the late 60s, let's say. He did this by introducing to the profession, certainly, but also to the middlebrow intellectual world, the crossover world of the New York Times, because he published these things about theory in the New York Times. I mean, he was and in Partisan Review and other places that people could read. These were not technical journals. So he's looking at people like Foucault and Derrida and Hélène Cixous and people like this in those years, and he's translating their difficult ideas for a public to try to show them that there's something happening here that's really important. And honestly, Kai, one of the things that was the most important to me in the writing of this biography was to find a way to translate those ideas myself so that people could understand that this venture into theory that he was involved in the way that I've just described it was not some sort of early life detour that he kind of outgrew. This had a lot to do with why he became politically effective later. That is, the very ideas that these people, these theorists were talking about, were once translated by him, a part of his formation, and made it possible for him to be rhetorically deft enough to pull off an Orientalism. So the thing is that, I'm sorry to go on for so long, but just the last point is that this last bit, after the success of Orientalism, which comes out in 1978, then in the 80s and 90s, theory becomes this jargon ridden, obscure, escape hatch sort of for humanities intellectuals who, stop communicating not only with, the public at large, but with their own colleagues, from an earlier generation, and they're defiant about it. And it's sort of like he's saying, this is an abdication of what the intellectual should be. So if this is where theory has gone, I'm sorry to have introduced it. We need to go out and read C. Wright Mills.
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating journey. And it reflects well on his ability to see what was happening around him. Here's a quote that I found just that jumped out at me. One of his other students, Rick Burns, the future filmmaker, once said, quote, "Being with him was like being with a playful, alternately super engaged, super self-absorbed, suddenly very funny, suddenly very angry or testy friend. A difficult friend who was also your best friend." Maybe we all have friends like this. This seems to capture his personality.
Well, it certainly, Rick gave me some beautiful quotations. He's very gifted at it, and I thought he really understood the Edward that I knew. I mean, we were there at the same time, so I did see Edward at the same time he saw Edward, and he actually worked as an assistant for a while. So I just thought he put that so beautifully.
Yeah.
And it's my experience as well. Certainly, this was the experience of his advisees, I would say, right? Where you are, in fact, terrified of him, you're in awe of him, but you're also completely charmed by him because he made you feel like you mattered and like you could do what anybody could do, you know? You're reading these people, you think they're so important. You're as good as that, that kind of thing. So he's the kind of guy that you would think wouldn't have time to like read a dissertation closely because he's too above it all. But the fact of the matter is that he was the kind of teacher who would reread a book before he came into the class, even if he'd read it 100 times. And he worked hard at his teaching. He prepared his lectures really, really dutifully. And he was somebody who really read your stuff closely when he got to it. And if he loved it, he would circulate it and talk it up. So, you both depended on him. You both thought, I could never be him. You want to like figure out how to make the decisions he made and all of those kinds of things. But at the same time, he was very, very scary. You wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of him.
So he had many intellectual fist fights. Um, On Orientalism, for instance, you write about his relationship with Sadiq al-Azam, the great Syrian philosopher. So apparently Al-Azam had I hadn't realized this, but Al-Azam had a critique of Orientalism. He didn't like it. Explain what happened in their relationship.
They weren't just good friends, they were really close friends. Sadiq al-Azam is a Syrian Marxist of the old school, traditional kind of Soviet-style Marxist, although I don't know if he supported the Soviet Union per se, but anyway, he was well-schooled in Marxism and identified with it openly. And he was there in Beirut, Lebanon, when Edward was just becoming more and more politically knowledgeable about the Palestinian resistance. It was a period where the PLO had moved from Jordan to Beirut, and so he could now get to know some of the people there um, firsthand. And Sadiq and he were really a part of that moment in both of their lives, roughly the same age, where they could diagnose the situation of the Arab dilemma together from a far left political perspective. And they didn't, of course, like a lot of what they were seeing about what was happening in the PLO, and they tried to push it in a more sane direction, a more effective direction, unsuccessfully. So they were comrades in arms, and I think it's fair to say rivals for the title of enfant terrible, of the Middle
Right.
East. So they were kind of in competition at the same time because Sadiq wasn't just a Marxist intellectual; he wrote blockbuster books attacking religious belief in the Middle East, for example. You can imagine
Very
how that
controversial.
would go over. Yeah. So he was very, very important in Edward's thinking, and they loved each other. Then Orientalism was written, and Sadiq wrote a very, very long and very, very harsh review of it for a journal that Edward was a co-editor of. And Edward was willing to publish the whole thing and then write a response. The other editors, Ibrahim Abulukhod and another, said no. It was too long, it was too ranting, and it was too personal. Anyway, the critique was that, here you are on the left in the Middle East. What are you trying to get people to do and to think, right? It's more like, let's turn towards rationalism. Let's talk about the foundations of science. Let's learn as much as we can from the modernity that has unfolded in the West in order to be able to converse on equal terms with the West. And that's the only basis upon which we can do this. And what does Edward do? Edward is writing a book that, from their point of view, is saying that there's an unchanging, undying West. It doesn't evolve. It's always the same. It's always guilty of the same prejudices. No. Plus, the turn towards scientific Marxism, which is what the left wanted to do, is being countered by him implicitly by the emphasis on culture and representation. So, from their point of view, this is a gift to the mullahs. His book was a gift to the mullahs. It created a notion of a bifurcation between the two places that was unbridgeable, which I don't think is at all accurate, by the way, but it's what their critique was.
I see. Well, he had, again, many battles. I'm thinking of, well, like Leon Wieseltier was another student who then appears in a debate with Edward Said on the side of Bernard Lewis. And I guess this gets into the issue of Palestine. But what happened to that relationship with
Well, I
Wiesel?
think it's fair to say that was an on again, off again relationship. It's not at all one of utter hostility, the way you would describe the
I mean, they
relationship.
shared an interest in music, for instance, I think. But
Shared an interest in music. Leon Wieseltier was a former student of Edwards. He admired his teaching immensely. He learned a lot from him. Once he became an important journalist in his own right, at the New Republic, they went out to dinner together or lunch together and things. They were friendly, and there was mutual admiration, I think it's fair to say. So I don't want to paint that picture as though it was all antipathetic. It wasn't. It's just that I think after Orientalism, I'm pretty clear it was after Orientalism, Wieseltier wrote a column, I think it was for the New Republic, I might be wrong about that, but he wrote one in which he accused Edward of being a pro-Soviet sympathizer, something like that,
Okay,
which is not accurate. I mean, not at all
right.
accurate. And
Not at
so,
all.
Edward, it was kind of a betrayal. It was what Edward called red baiting of a sort that one associated with McCarthyism, and he couldn't understand how someone could do something like that. I think, though, that it wasn't completely irreparable because while Wieseltier went and acted as the adjutant, as it were, for Bernard Lewis in that famous debate in I think it was 1986 in Boston, he did, in his interviews with me later, admit that he felt that Bernard Lewis had given that debate away, that he had lost because
He
uh,
got up and just made a series of jokes and
right, and they were jokes that one could
fell
arguably
flat.
say were not weren't off color. They were just sort of in bad taste that were Orientalist jokes. He
Right.
thought that this would make it all go away and make light of it, but it was really sort of revealing in a bad way.
So that brings me to asking you about The Nation magazine and his relationship to The Nation and Coburn, Alexander Coburn, and Christopher Hitchens. I think I have a small quibble with you on your characterization of his relationship with Victor Navasky, the editor. I think they were actually quite close, and Victor, well, I was there. Victor would send me out to sort of try to persuade Edward to do more, to
Yeah,
publish more in the magazine,
yeah.
and you leave it. You have the suggestion that there was coldness
Yeah,
or
it wasn't hostility. It was just kind of a coldness and a wariness, maybe even a little lack of trust. I think, you know,
well, actually, my memory is that, again, I was a, a young editor in my late 20s, but Victor was very open. He's always been very open to arguments about Palestine and Israel,
right,
and published many voices that were very critical of Israel. And he wanted Edward to write more. Uh,
right,
Edward wanted to write the music column, but it was harder to get him actually to write about politics in Palestine, because maybe it's the period that I was seeing him in the late 70s and early 80s. He was also playing this delicate diplomatic role with the PLO, and there was only, he could only go so far in saying certain things, and
right,
we were pushing him to try to make news,
right,
and
right,
so maybe
right.
that's part of it. But
Well, I should have interviewed you. I'm sorry that I didn't.
well,
I interviewed
there's always more. But
three or four people who worked with him at the Nation and got lots of different points of view. And this gets back to that point about the difficulty in writing a biography that you try to triangulate by
yeah, right.
comparing what other people say. And the picture that emerged for me, the perception on the side of the people that I talked to, obviously in their majority, was this one that I presented in the biography. But I'm wholly open to the idea that perhaps it was not exactly right. Maybe Navasky and he did get along in a different way. I will say that the Nation was very important for him. I mean, it was a really, really important platform for him at a delicate time for him in the New York media world. On the one hand, he's the kind of go-to guy, given
And he
his
was getting into the
savoir-faire.
New York Times, and
Right. His savoir-faire, his knowledge of events, his being the unofficial liaison between the State Department and the PLO leadership, all of that made him the go-to guy. So you could say that, well, for as many people in the New York media world that wanted to shut him up, there were also others that thought, let's give this guy the platform before anybody else because he's the one guy that we can trust to give us something interesting. So it was mixed. It was a mixed bag in that way. But I do think that there was a period right after his publication of The Question of Palestine in 1979, which is a book the like of which nobody had really seen. It was just so well written and there were so many facts and it was so patiently laid out. it was a book critical of Zionism in a completely different way. And I think it really made a big impact. It caught the attention of Time magazine and made his name, but of course it also made him notorious among people who wanted the old dispensation to continue. So he was, at least he felt he was at the time, shunted away from or kept out of certain circles in the media, and he needed to make new friends. And he found them in this cohort that was represented primarily by Joanne Wipaszewski and Alexander Coburn
Coburn
and Hitchens, who was
and
then still
Hitchens,
writing for
right?
the Nation. Yeah.
So do you have any insight into what happened to Hitchens and his relationship with Syed and why he wrote that infamous piece in the Atlantic on the verge of Syed's death?
I'd love to share with you what I wrote that Edward never got to read. I'd love to send that to you because that kind of spells it out. I think that there were always these elements in Hitchens that were waiting to surface. He identified strongly with other writers earlier, famous ones like George Orwell,
Right.
who underwent, I
Constantly
think,
quoting
a
Orwell.
similar kind of transformation, right? Where they identify with the left, but they also feel very strongly that one needs to be deeply critical of the left at the same time, which is a good thing. But I think the kind of criticism they had of the left, even while they were identifying with the left, was one that led them eventually to um, favor the circles of power more than the political position. So in my reading, Hitchens, you might recall, was caught feeding information to Kenneth Starr during the
About the
impeachment
impeachment.
hearings.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you're thinking like, well, it's one thing to be critical of Clinton and to not fall for this notion that as a Democrat, he's somehow progressive. Really, he's not. And therefore, it's completely coherent to be on the left and critical of Clinton. But to feed information that is compromising to Kenneth Starr, that is something else. So when he was caught out there, I think he thought, well, I've got two choices. My name's besmirched if I stay in the circles of the left. No one will trust me anymore, or I'll just go where I naturally wanted to go anyway, which is over here where there's uh, better speakers' fees and a larger audience.
Uh, well, he certainly did have, I remember having conversations with him about Clinton. He had an animus towards the Clintons that was very deep. And he wrote this, sharp little sharp-tongued book, No One Left to Lie to, um, in 1998, I think. So we're running out of time, but can you talk a little bit about Edward's sort of roller coaster relationship with Arafat? Why he became, he played this very well, at first, I think, constructive role, trying to push Arafat to engage politically, to talk about Palestinian rights in a political venue rather than as armed struggle. Um, and and yet then when Oslo happens, Said becomes the great Palestinian critic of it, and they have this terrible falling out.
Yeah.
And you quote at one point in the book, you quote his son Wadi, saying he lived this last decade of his life in a permanent state of rage and hurt.
Right.
Uh, it's a very powerful quote. But
Yeah.
talk about Arafat and Said.
Well, he got to know him in Beirut in probably, I'd say, following 1973, because he really gets to know him for the first time when he's back in New York and Arafat shows up to give that very, very famous speech that he delivered at the UN, right? That ends with "Don't let the what is it, the dove fall from, I don't know, some
Right.
the piece fall from my hand." And Edward was involved in the writing of that speech in a way. He didn't really compose it, but he helped put it into its final shape and helped put it into idiomatic American English. And it's in that relationship. He knew certain PLO members before that, even high up members. like Shafi al-Hut, but he didn't really know Arafat, but he gets to know Arafat. And he has an affection for Arafat. He thinks this is not who I thought he was. This is a guy who's tender, who's funny, who's very, very solicitous, taking notes all the time. He always had a pen and paper with him. And Edward admired him. I mean, simply because he was courageous to be the head of the PLO. It was a dangerous thing to do. And his dedication to the Palestinian cause, that is Arafat's, was unquestionable. So, for all of those reasons, those personal qualities, he really, really supports him. But more than anything, remember, the PLO wasn't always the unique representative of the Palestinian people. There were lots of different factions. And he, that is Arafat, had the ability to bring them all together under one umbrella. And that was masterful. So, as far as that went, Arafat was in his good book and he was very friendly with him and did things to help humanize him, right? To write this unbelievable article for Interview magazine, Andy Warhol's Interview magazine, saying something like "My Breakfast with Arafat," in which he makes him seem likable,
Uh-huh.
which was a hard thing to do in America at that time.
Very hard.
So, but he never ever felt that Arafat had the right strategy for the Palestinian cause. That he always had the tendency, as did other PLO leaders, of seeking back channels to people in power and thinking that he could like cut a deal with people and not have to go out and convince the public about anything. And whenever Edward and others like Noam Chomsky would try to counsel the PLO leadership to say, look, you need to win over the American public. I mean, it's the United States that is the greatest aider and abetter of Israel. If you want to make a different kind of point, you're going to have to convince them. But they would write that off and say, well,
Right.
Edward is too Americanized. He's over there in New York. He's out of touch. He doesn't know about things on the ground. So it was a very, very frustrating back and forth. And amazing offers under the Carter administration were made that Edward was asked to go and convince Arafat to accept. And he wouldn't. It was absolutely astounding.
Yeah.
So by the time Oslo came around, it was a very, very brave thing for Edward to do to stand against it because almost everybody officially.
Everyone was, I remember myself trying to argue with people. Yeah, Oslo can work.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a
yeah,
watershed. We've got to be hopeful.
right.
Um,
So
and,
he really he put himself out on a limb and he just said,
and Syed was the great critic, and I didn't understand it. But, in retrospect, he turns out to have been prophetic.
yeah,
It didn't work. It has taken us into a dead end, a stalemate, and here we are with no solution in sight. And so I don't know. That leads me to ask you, Tim, is this biography also sort of a vehicle for exploring or telling the story of the death of the two-state solution? I mean, do you have any hope for a two-state solution at this point, or do you think if Edward was still with us today, he would have a different path forward?
I don't think he would have a different path forward. I think he would believe, that he would believe in the slogan that he tried to popularize: two people in one land, two peoples in one land, right? And I think that, and it's my view as well. I'm persuaded not only by Edward but by others, because Edward didn't by any means invent the one state solution. He simply revived it. It had been an idea from the very founding of Israel in 1948. Um, but it's important. I think Chomsky is very clear about this too. That when one says the one state solution, we're not talking about giving overnight all Palestinians equal voting rights in a single state. It would be more of a gradual thing where you first have different kinds of sovereignty that are recognized among Palestinians and Israelis, and that it would work slowly towards a federation that then would eventually become a single state. But the facts on the ground are that there is just one state. I mean, clearly, if the occupied territories are being talked about as being annexed openly, which is what's being discussed right now, and there's no sovereignty and it's militarily occupied, and all of the work is organized by the Israeli government, that you really have one state, whether you recognize it or not. And therefore, the question is, what kind of state do you want it to be? Is it going to be a state with equal rights or not? And so I think that that's the whole discussion shifts a little bit, right? It's not about the maintaining the integrity of territorial borders, but it's more about the treatment of people within a common political entity.
So I've I've captivated almost all of our time, but we're going to go over a little bit. We have lots of questions. Let's see. Someone points out that the quote that you were looking for was, "Today I come bearing an olive branch in one hand and the freedom fighter's gun in the other. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand."
Thank
So
you.
this is
Thank
what
you.
Arafat
Yeah.
said. Let's see. My friend Keith Leslie asks, what exactly was Syed's opening gambit in the famous Orientalism book from 1978 in his attempt to reframe the perceived Eurocentric hegemony? What was at issue with European art, since artist adventures such as Jerome and before? Did he ever genuinely feel the relations could find any equanimity? Uh, we've talked a little bit about
Yeah,
that,
I
but
think, I mean, the first thing I'll say about Orientalism is, although the popular perception of it is absolutely correct, that it's about fantasy projections from the West about the East, the creation of an other, the arresting of an entire region in its own past, as though it, weren't part of modernity and those kinds of questions. That is, of course, what Orientalism is partly about. But two of the greatest influences on Edwards' thinking were Orientalists, Jacques Berck and Maxime Rodenson. And in Orientalism, if you actually read it closely, you begin to appreciate that while he's criticizing an inexorable system of images and routines and representations, that he's also admiring to a great deal the individual philologists who are Orientalists for their immense powers of linguistic learning, and their ability, although specialists in the archive going over minutiae, to create this grand cultural drama that captivates people's imaginations. And it's really clear when you begin to see this alongside Edwards' other thinking, that he's apprenticing himself in some ways at the feet of the Orientalists. He's saying this proves that the humanities, when properly managed, has the authority to affect public opinion and change policies through many layers of mediation, perhaps, but it happens. And so he's saying, how did they do that? What was it about these marvelous uh, Orientalists like Raymond Schwab and Massignon and people like that? So he's trying to learn from them. And I think that the success of Orientalism shows that he studied them well.
so you think the book still stands up very well?
I do. I think, as you know from reading the bio, I'm very critical of certain aspects of it. I think that it bends the stick too far, and that it does, in fact, and I think this is implicit in this wonderful question that we just had. It does imply that you can't really be European and not be guilty of an entirely dominating disposition vis-a-vis the Arabs, and he does at times fall into that language. And I think he did it strategically. I think he wanted to create anger at the time that he wrote it, and bring on board people who would only do so if they felt completely liberated to finally pick up the ideological arms, as it were, and fight. And so he does go to extremes at times that I think is wrong. It doesn't hold up some of these statements that he makes.
So another questioner asks, is it correct that Martin Buber lived in the Syed ancestral home in Jerusalem?
It is true that I think when Edward in the early 90s goes back to film, I think it's the early 90s. I might be wrong about that, but he goes back to make a film of his childhood home. Uh, he goes to the place where um, he was born and where his family would stay when they were in Jerusalem, where he lived when he was going to school in Jerusalem. And I think at the time that he was there, it wasn't Martin Buber who was there, but I think it was Martin Buber had in the interim lived in that house. So that is in fact true.
So here's another question from Adi Al-Mohsen. Quick comment on psychology history in the Arab world. I'm not sure if it'd be the fault of Syed himself, but despite his problematics, the Arab world had a healthy debate and output on psychology, psychoanalysis, and the place of psychology in art. I really appreciated Tim's in-depth archival study of Syed's life and his intellectual journey. Anyway, he goes on. This is really more of a comment, I guess. Can you tell us about Edward's fiction and poetry writings?
This was a discovery I made. I think it probably is the case that some people who knew him were aware of some of this. Certainly, Mariam, his wife, was. But I think that most of the people he knew, even people he knew very closely, were unaware of the fact that he had tried at two different times in his life to write a novel, and that he, in fact, had done a lot of writing on that novel. So it's not any more than fragments, I would say. It's only fair to point that out. So the first one maybe 70 pages, and then the other one 45 pages, but in both cases with extensive notes that show, who the cast of characters were, what the story was going to be about, and so on. It's important for lots of reasons. One, it shows the sacrifice later in his life of his aesthetic sensibilities in favor of reading literature for their historical and political contents, which I think he was very open about in the book Culture and Imperialism, that he would be sensitive enough to this particular genre of expressing himself as an intellectual, fiction, that he would actually undertake to do this. He finished a very, very fine short story. It's an excellent short story that he submitted to the New Yorker in 1965 called An Arc for the Listener, which shows that he could, in fact, see it through. He could write. And I think that had he wanted to, he could have finished one or both of these novels. But he didn't. And it's interesting that he didn't, partly because some of the genres that he explored writing in to get his essayistic ideas across were novelistic in their own way. Clearly, the memoir is that way. If anybody's read it, it's like very novelistic. It's beautiful, Proustian, wonderful. But also the poetic reflections of the photo text collage after The Last Sky, where he is able to, express himself more artistically. But here's the thing that I think is very important. I don't think that he didn't finish the novels because he couldn't. I think he refused to finish them. And I think he refused because a novelist needs to capture the world as it is and be fearless in following through the logic of the characters in their story. Whereas I think he didn't want to do that. I think he wanted to imagine a world that was not, but that yet might be. And that required nonfiction of the sort that he wrote.
Right.
Secondly, one last point in that he was very sensitive to the idea that in a technocratic culture like we have in the United States, that there's this inordinate authority bestowed upon poets and novelists. They become the people in the humanities who are the good guys. And he was always trying to say that the intellectuals, the kind of the preservers of historical memory and the creator of new agendas, these are the people who are at least as important. And he wanted to put his money there.
So someone asks also, did Syed have any meaningful exchanges with African-American intellectuals or scholars of Black studies? And another viewer asks, wasn't one of his students Cornell West?
Student, not really. Not student. Not student, but deep admirer. So, in a way, you're answering your own question. Yes, he did. And there's in the archive a lot of correspondence that goes on between Henry Louis Gates and Edward, where Henry Louis Gates is constantly emphasizing how important he is to African American intellectuals in the United States. And there's a very, very cordial, warm correspondence between them on this very point. So it's Edward doing his thing that is speaking at events that are organized by the likes of Gates. It's him helping people behind the scenes to get appointments,
Mhm.
places, and that sort of thing. He just simply didn't know African American literature. That wasn't his specialization. So he couldn't, there was a limit to how much, commerce went on there intellectually, but there's all this kind of evidence. So he was very much about that. And then, of course, it is Cornell West more than anyone who was Cornell taught across the street at the Union Theological Seminary in the years that I was a graduate student, actually. So Cornell, before he was Cornell, before everybody knew him, he would be coming over to our seminars and he'd be sitting on the periphery, kind of outside the circle, as it were, kibitzing, from the side. So he's very much a part of the intellectual life of Columbia. And Edward invited him to his Monday colloquium that was uniquely Edwards, and invited Cornell. So they're very close. And when Orientalism came out in 1978, there's this wonderful letter that Cornell West writes to Edwards saying, "You are on a Gramscian road," right? Which he knew,
Oh.
uh, referring to Antonio Gramsci, a great Italian communist who was one of Edwards' most important influences intellectually.
Um, let's see, other questions. Well, you've actually answered this in a way, but was Syed an anthropologist of sorts?
I would say no, but he did venture into anthropology in a famous essay, one that some of his former students who were, in fact, professional anthropologists thought that he was maybe too hard on the field, that the field had already been involved in its own self critique along these lines. But he wrote a very, very prominent essay called something about anthropology's interlocutors, in which he called into question the role played by anthropologists in the field as ethnographers and the historical fact that many of them were involved in giving information about Native peoples to American governmental interests to the disadvantage of the Native peoples. But not only that, the whole relationship that is established when one goes off to another culture, no matter how much respect is involved, the physical fact of the matter is, as Edward would have seen it, that as you accumulate knowledge of the people, you are acquiring control over them. And I think these are the kinds of issues that Edward rather testily uh, brought to bear in this challenge, if I could put it that way, to the field of anthropology. In part, he was motivated to do this because of the critique he had received from some prominent anthropologists, ethnographers like James Clifford.
So, what was his relationship to his fellow Palestinian Ibrahim Abu Lughod?
Well, they were a one-two punch. They were a force to be reckoned with in tandem. So they really got to know each other in this very important organization not a lot of people know about, called the AAUG, which is the Arab American Association of University Graduates. And it's the speeches that Edward writes to this group, addressing this group, that catch the attention of the FBI and that the FBI is worried about because Edward at this point is not really a good public speaker. It's funny. He fumbled and he was nervous and not really eloquent. This is something he learned,
Hmm.
and he's also learning how to become a better writer. He wasn't really such a great writer, according to his colleagues at Columbia and some of the people in the early days of the AAUG. So you could say that it's with Ibrahim, who he met by chance. Ibrahim's a little older. He met him as an undergraduate at Princeton, and just the friendship got cemented because Ibrahim was going to Cairo for a year for reasons I can't remember. I think it was some UN related thing, and still like kind of grad school age. And Edward was taking a year off between college and grad school to go back to Cairo to work in his father's business and to play piano. So they happened right after meeting one another and hitting it off to be in the same place, and that cemented the relationship. And Ibrahim was very important for radicalizing Edward, for teaching him about the legacies of the anti-colonial liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s. So Edward's life changes because of Ibrahim. And it's Ibrahim who,
It's a
yeah,
very important relationship.
yeah, very important. He invites Edward to write a piece called The Arab Portrayed. And that's the essay that Edward writes that makes his name in Arab circles, about the misrepresentation of Arabs as a people, as types.
So, Timothy, we've gone over the hour, but here's one last question. In your conclusion, I was surprised to see you write, he probably would have found a way to win again in the age of Trump. What did you mean by that? If he'd been still with us in the age of Trump, Syed would have been, as a public intellectual, able to steer the debate?
Steer the debate, no, maybe not, but affect the debate, certainly. I think that when I say win, I don't mean necessarily that he would have been able to overthrow the regime of Donald Trump.
Right.
Let's be clear about that. That's not what I mean. But by winning, I mean creating a pole of attraction for intellectuals and giving them a model of how to speak to power, and to do so in a way that is disarming, that is authorizing, that is professionally respectable and militant at the same time. This is a hard combination. And I think anybody who saw him kind of rise to prominence, who taught literature for a living, or even was a university professor of any sort, was just amazed at how a person could get a hearing in the higher echelons of power. I mean, this is a person who's invited to the Council on Foreign Relations routinely. He's at the State Department. He's debating Benjamin Netanyahu on television. I mean, and he's a literature professor. So you think to yourself, what we do is important. What we do matters. And we should be public intellectuals. This is what you feel when you're around him. So I'm just saying that in the immense cynicism and despair of the Trump years, I think that he would have kept the idea of liberty and justice, without quotation marks, alive. And I think that that's winning.
Yeah, he was certainly a remarkably articulate and effective public intellectual. And we obviously need more of those kinds of people in our lives. Our society would be better. So here's the book. I hold it up one more time. And thank you, Timothy, for writing it. Thank you for being here this evening. It was
so much for
a fascinating conversation. And I hope you go on to sell many books.
Okay. Thank you, Kai. Really
All right.
wonderful to be
Good night.
here. Yeah. All right.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
everyone.
Yeah.